Well, hey everybody, welcome back. My name again is Bita Hanavar. I'm on the board here at the Atlanta Photojournalism Seminar. Now we have with us Carolyn Cole of the Los Angeles Times. Carolyn's covered national and international news for the Los Angeles Times since 1994. She is a two-time winner of the Robert Capa Courage in Photography Award and has earned 4 World Press Awards. Her work on the civil crisis in Liberia won the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for Feature Photography. In 2016, Carolyn earned the Robert F. Kennedy Award for International Photography for her coverage of the mass migration of Syrians across Europe. She is a graduate of the University of Texas and Ohio University and recently moved back to California from New York to pursue her interests in environmental journalism. Carolyn wanted me to mention that she is not here today because she loves public speaking, but because she wants to give back to the profession that's given so much to her. She's going to share some of the lessons she's learned from her long career with you. Carolyn?
Oh, thank you, Betta. I'm very honored to join you here today at the Atlanta Seminar and to follow Alyssa and Ben's great presentation. The Atlantic Seminars holds a special place in my heart because I attended back in the late 1980s. I remember driving to North Carolina where my grandparents were living at the time and renting an enlarger, printing my 11 by 14 prints and putting on blackboards and then driving down to Atlanta. I don't think I won anything. I don't think I won any prizes, but it motivated me to try harder. And I hope that the seminar has done the same for you this week, not only to provide you with great information, but also to motivate you to push forward during this difficult time. I feel so fortunate to have found photojournalism and to have been able to document many of the important events of the past 3 decades. At one time, it seemed that the events of September 11th and post 9/11 would never be surpassed. But time marches on, and many of you probably don't even remember the Iraq War. I think the times we're living in now are just as historically critical, if not more, than any that we have faced before, including the pandemic, the election, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Me Too movements, mass immigration, and the climate crisis. People will be looking back at this moment in history for years to come. And I believe it's our responsibility to document these times and bring them to the attention those issues that we face as individuals, as communities, and as a country. I'd like to share just a few of the things I've learned over my very long career that have helped me to continue. I still believe that journalism school, and particularly photojournalism programs and seminars such as this around the country, are the best way to accelerate your career. I took my first photojournalism class as a sophomore in college, and I was hooked. But because I got a late start, I never worked at the local newspaper or the school newspaper. So I was advised to go back to graduate school. And from there, it led to an internship in El Paso, Texas. And that was a turning point for me. We'll start the slides now. In El Paso, I was working on the border between Texas and Mexico, and covering both sides of the border, including the political unrest that was going on in Juarez, Mexico. Growing up in the suburbs, I never witnessed anything such as this with very passionate people. And in those 2 years, I started on my path to covering international news. But while I was there, I also experienced the cultural differences of other countries, such as this young boy who had died of cancer. And their position of the culture there, they treat death a little bit differently than they do in the United States. And I learned that you can't just assume that all countries have the same experience. That was also true in Haiti and other countries that I've visited. So I really recommend spending time at a small newspaper or someplace you can practice your skills on a regular basis to gain that kind of experience that you'll need. And just looking at the slides that we just saw from Alyssa and Ben, local coverage is the best place to gain that experience. Mine just happened to be in El Paso, which was on the border, so I had a little bit of more of an international feel to it. Do you think we could bring the image up so that we just see the images here? Not sure if anyone's, there we go. So after El Paso and 2 years at the San Francisco Examiner, I moved to Mexico City to work as a freelancer. And that was a place where I started to travel alone and to learn how to navigate other countries as a journalist, and learning how to stay safe, learning about logistics, how to get places, how to get back, how to move around and do the job. I then got hired to do a freelance assignment, which took me to Haiti for AP. At that time, the U.S. government was heavily involved in Haiti and trying to bring in a new president. There was a rebel uprising that forced out President Aristide. And that was really my first experience covering conflict in any way. We sort of skipped over that last picture, but he was actually somebody who had who was trying to get food from the port area and got shot while trying to get food. And also the consequences of war and poverty. This boy is basically an indentured slave. His family can't afford to take care of him, so they not necessarily sold, but placed him with somebody who was using him as a worker. At the end of the day, he would then take a bath in this very dirty canal in the port area. And I returned to Haiti in 2010 for the Haiti earthquake, which resulted in the death of over 100,000 people. It was just really devastating. Not only the number of people who were killed, but the number of people who were displaced. I encountered a woman named Rose who had broken her back and was outside of the hospital for help. I couldn't help her that day, but I did go back about 6 months later and was able to find her and find out that she had greatly improved. Another major disaster that I covered was Hurricane Katrina, which we're all familiar with, although now with global warming, it seems like we have a Hurricane Katrina every year. And again, this is a situation that was sort of hard to get into, but by the time I arrived on the second day, the flooding was already so high that it was actually hard to drive into the city. Once I was there, I found this family who had left their home just with a Bible and were trying to make their way to the Superdome, where there was a shelter set up. I found elderly people underneath the freeways who were waiting to be evacuated by buses and helicopters. And I found this young boy, Dylan Chansey, who had ridden out the storm with his parents on the top of a tree after their home was completely destroyed. And my goal is to take pictures that move people and to make, whether it's AIDS orphans like this young girl in Africa, in Swaziland, or this boy who's making bricks in Sudan to help support his family, or these AIDS orphans who are trying to start a new life in a mission, or these boys who are collecting cans and bottles in California to help their mom pay the rent. I think what's helped me is having a very clear sense of purpose, why I'm there, what my goal is, and trying to stay focused on that. That's especially true when going places where the US government is involved, like Iraq. I went to Iraq before the war started and was able to get some images of just to sort of introduce the Iraqi people to the US people. And I think that was very important in my coverage. I also went to Albania when the UN forces were bombing to try to end the war there. That was back in the late 1990s. And this was an election violence that was in Kenya. These soldiers were going door to door looking for rebel rousers, basically trying to drag them out of their homes. And I was in Pakistan when Benazir Bhutto, just after Benazir Bhutto was assassinated. This is a more recent photo after Obama started lifting sanctions in Cuba. I've been to Cuba about 4 times. And again, it's about the impact the US government has on all of these countries. We seem to have our footprint in many places. It's also true for Iran. I went to Iran just a few years ago when they were trying to lift the sanctions, but in the end, President Trump reinstituted them. Just the hardships it's caused to the people in Iran. And I followed the Iraq War from beginning to end, although in the middle part of the war, it was far too dangerous. This is actually as the troops were leaving Iraq. I also went to Sudan a number of times during the Darfur conflict. And although we weren't directly involved there was basically talk of genocide going on. These were some young rebels training in Chad, just across the border from Sudan. And a young girl in one of the refugee camps. This was very early in the conflict, so the structures were very minimal. But by now, they're full cities, you know, mud homes with basically full communities. These are young girls and women collecting firewood and water together so that they wouldn't get harmed. And one of the difficult things about covering the Sudan conflict was that I was never able to see the mass graves or the bodies that resulted from what was considered a genocide. And I really do believe that photography, one of the purposes of photography is to bear witness. And that was a real struggle for me, not being able to find mass graves or the bodies. This was two young children whose father was killed by the Janjaweed by the government militias. And again, the Janjaweed, which were the government militias, were very hard to find. I believe this is the only image I was able to take of one of them. The Egyptian uprising was also a very important story that I covered. And this was a real turning point for the way journalists have been treated. Before the Egyptian revolution, before the Egyptian uprising and then the consequence of Arab Spring, most of the time journalists were treated with respect. People understood their role. I always felt that I was somewhat protected having the credentials of a journalist. But with the uprising of ISIS and the more numerous attacks on journalists, that just is no longer true. And after the Egyptian revolution, I only spent maybe a couple of weeks there. Most of the journalists then went on to the Libyan uprising, but I did not. I never went to Syria as well, because by that point, journalists were having their heads cut off, and it just became too dangerous. And also, as I said, many of the newspapers had decided that it was not worth the risk of sending their own journalists to go to cover these stories. There's also been a big shift because technology has changed that, in the fact that there are plenty of digital cameras, and there was plenty of Wi-Fi. For instance, when I was covering some of the previous conflicts, those things weren't available. So you needed foreign journalists such as myself to go to these places to cover things, to be able to get the information out quickly enough. But that's no longer really the case. And in many of these countries, there's very well-trained journalists who can cover their own stories. Israel was another story that I was sort of reluctant to go cover. I felt like local journalists had an advantage, knowing the story better, knowing the cities that were involved, and just the front line basically. But I learned that being an outsider actually worked to my advantage, because I was able to cross from the West Bank and into Gaza and into the West Bank with no problem whatsoever. Later, I covered the war in South Lebanon, the Lebanese-Israeli war, and just the total devastation that left of Beirut and southern Lebanon. Again, the American government being such a heavy supporter of the Israeli government, I felt it's my duty to be there to cover what impact that's having on the local people. This woman was trapped in her home or in her building, and because of all the heavy destruction of roads and buildings, she was unable to get out until some journalists showed up, and then some journalists were able to connect her with the Red Cross, and she was evacuated. But it really was a terrifying situation. The children were terrified. There was constant bombing, and in the end, one of the bombings, the bombing of Kana, was an important turning point, because so many women and children and civilians were killed, that it led to more negotiations and a cease in the war. Another important story from my career was the standoff at the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. This was a case where over 300 Palestinians took refuge inside the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem as the Israeli tanks and soldiers surrounded them outside. And for any of you who have been to Israel, it's a beautiful country, and Bethlehem is particularly beautiful. Of course, being the supposed birthplace of Jesus, and having all of this kind of conflict going on in such a holy area. I was the only journalist that was able to get inside the church during that 30-day period to sort of tell the story from the Palestinian side. Me to the point where I really think it's important to try to find I think that the stories that stand out the most for me are in the places that I've been the only journalist or where there have been very few journalists. And it just, to me, it makes a point that you need to try to find your own path and to get away from the pack, even if there is a pack. And in this case, there were hundreds of journalists covering this conflict. But the fact that I was able to get inside the church made it an exclusive story for me. In the end, well, actually, I think about I was in the church for 10 days. All of the Palestinians had been in there for about 30 days, and there was no food, very little food and water inside the church, and many of the men started to get sick. They were eating leaves from a living tree out in the back courtyard. There just was very, very little to eat, and they just basically were waiting as the negotiations were going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. This was the leader of the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigade, so he was a high commander within the Palestinian organization. And here's some soldiers that are protecting one of the back entrances to the church, which had undergone a fire, and they were afraid the Israelis would come in through that tunnel. Some of the men who had been injured, the priests would come in every day and pray with them, or pray for them, I should say. I think it was just a few days when I was in there that one man was shot by a sniper gun that was actually mounted on a crane hanging over the church into the courtyard. He was shot in the side, and you can't even really see much damage to his left side there where they're holding him. But it took so long for them to negotiate the transport of his body out to the hospital that he died on the way to the hospital. And these are men that are watching him being evacuated. So two things that came during that time. First of all, the exclusivity of being the only one in there. Also, there was a lot of technical problems because I was in there for so long and I only had one camera battery. And then trying to get the images out of the church so that they wouldn't be confiscated. I was able to smuggle out most of my discs, my cards before the end of the conflict. And the other thing is I had no idea how long the standoff was going to take. So there was a lot of practical matters for that. Regarding post 9/11, by the time 9/11 happened, I had probably 15 years of international experience. And so I was chosen from the LA Times to be one of the photographers to go. I went 1 month after the bombing of the World Trade Center and was there as the Northern Alliance were getting support from the Americans in terms of bombing and trying to root out the Taliban. This is actually the day that the Taliban fled Kabul. And of course, we all know that this is not a good story, that the story continued on for 20 years and we're still dealing with it to this day. And now the Taliban are basically have negotiated their way back into a share power situation. These are some men that were being held as suspected Taliban fighters. They were being held in like a shipping container. And of course, the story of the women of Afghanistan has been very important. This was, early on in the conflict. Women still hadn't taken off their burqas, and I haven't been back in several years now, so I'm not sure, but things are starting to deteriorate again, and people are putting back on the burqa. And we don't know what will happen after the Americans complete withdrawal and the Taliban get back into a sort of power sharing situation with the government. And right after Afghanistan, it wasn't long before I was sent to Iraq. The important thing about my experience there was that I was sent to cover the Iraqi side of the conflict. In other words, I went to Baghdad a month before the war began. In addition, we had several reporters and photographers that were embedded with the military, US military. So this was another case where my goal was to show what impact the American government was having on the Iraqi people as before the bombing began and then as the bombing began. Oh, I'm sorry, that last photo. These two photos are of the Iraqi soldiers, the Iraqi military, which Saddam Hussein was trying to parade around to show how much force he had and that the Americans would not succeed. And many Iraqis didn't believe that the Americans would ever make it to Baghdad, just based on what Saddam was showing them. This was an instance where it was believed that an American plane had been shot down in the Tigris River, and everyone came out to cheer and shout to see these Americans. But in the end, there was no plane found. And this was an American tank just on near the airport in Baghdad that was actually was hit. But then I think the Americans blew it up themselves because they didn't want the Iraqi soldiers to take charge of it. So these are people out celebrating on this American tank just south of the center of town. And once the bombing began, obviously I was doing a lot of coverage of civilian death and civilian impact. Again, I think it's important that we had journalists on both sides of this conflict, those with the military, US military, and those with the civilians. This was a case where their family members were shot in the car because they didn't understand the command to stop. And this was the day the Americans arrived in Baghdad. I'm sorry, the day after the Americans arrived in Baghdad, and the bodies of their relatives had been brought back to their home. And unfortunately, this happened time and time again during the Iraq War. And then as soon as Saddam was out of power, all of his statues and paintings were covered up. This is a woman who had some rope burns around her neck. She was in a mental institution, but because of the war, the caretakers had fled. And then the looting of the palaces and all of Saddam's properties. There was one instance where the bodies of victims of Saddam's regime were uncovered in southern Iraq. People were able to go back and find the relatives that they'd been missing for many years. And then I also did an embed with the U.S. Marines during the Battle of Najaf. It's just war paint, very hot and awaiting. These men were detained during my time within the embed, and I look at this picture as a symbol of why, our position in Iraq was so negative. I mean, the way that we treated people, these people were detained not knowing whether or not they were bad or good, and that was part of the problem, that the U.S. military couldn't determine who the bad guys really were. I've since gone back to cover the conflict in Mosul a couple of years ago, but now I've really turned towards more environmental journalism, so I'm not doing as much conflict any longer. But obviously at this time, this story was of the utmost importance to me, and I felt a real responsibility to be covering this as an American photographer. I also think that it's important that we let people know that we're, what country we're from, who our organizations are. And so I always wanted them to know that I was an American photographer, photojournalist there to show their side of the story. The only time I wouldn't do that is if the driver and translator felt that it was putting them at a greater risk. These are some men that were detained, supposed terrorists in northern Pakistan during one of the efforts to get rid of the Taliban. So in this case, I was on an embed with the Pakistani military, and one day I heard chains kind of dragging along the floor above me. And when I just stepped out and realized that they were detaining people upstairs in these rooms in the dark. In 2004 or 2003, actually, my editors asked me to go to Liberia, and it was the first time I'd actually been in Africa at that point. Um, I didn't know very much about Liberia. I didn't know that it was founded by former American slaves, and this is a man um, holding a picture of his American relatives. The Liberian people also still have a very strong connection with America, and a lot of their architecture at that time looked very old Southern, U.S. Southern. Um, so I arrived as the war was reaching a climax. The war had been going on for a very long time, and there was a possibility that President Bush was going to be sending in troops to try to end the long civil war that was going on there. People were finding refuge in schools and churches, anticipating that the rebels were moving closer to the main capital. And as the rebels did advance, they started squeezing people into Monrovia, and then they started sending mortar fire. And this is just the result of indiscriminate mortar fire on a civilian population, a very tight situation. Monrovia is a very small town, and basically the large amount of the population was cut off from the port area, which was where all the food supplies were. And so these people were wading across the river to try to get some food from the port area and take back to their homes. And the government and both sides used primarily child soldiers during this conflict. Just a lot of mental torture and drug use amongst the soldiers just to keep them out there fighting. This was a rebel commander disciplining one of his soldiers. And this man is not dead. He's at a local. The hospital is basically all closed, and many of the NGOs shut up their. Excuse me. They closed their tents. There was very little place for them to get medical attention. But this man was transported eventually to get medical attention, as this young girl was. And this is just gives you an idea of how much firepower there was. This man had just carried his comrade back from the front line where he had been mortally wounded. And the thing about war is that it is ugly. It's terrible. And, I don't think you can shy away from covering what's there, but I try to do it in a way that people will look. Actually, they should see what's happening in these countries. Unfortunately, President Bush decided that he would not send troops to Liberia because of the fact that we were already involved in Iraq and Afghanistan, and because we had just experienced a pretty bad situation in Somalia. And he didn't want to get re-involved in another conflict. So in the end, he sent the African peacekeepers were sent into Liberia. And then they elected their first female president of any country in Africa. And this young girl I met in an orphanage in Liberia during that time. And in fact, she's kept in touch with me and told me that seeing me there in the orphanage during that time gave her hope that something was going to happen. And actually, she just gave me a call last week. So it's a big issue in my career, not only because I started in El Paso, I'm also covering immigration issues now down in Texas. But then you can't surpass the 1 million person march across Europe in 2015, where the majority of them were Syrians fleeing their country. I went to Greece to get them arriving in Greece. The distance between Turkey and Greece was very small, but unfortunately, the people smugglers were reusing, inflatables that were not of sound condition, and so that was leading to um, too many people dying on a very short crossing. Not only Syrians, but these were Afghanis that were trying to escape their country in conflict. I didn't have a reporter working with me during this time. Um, I was basically working on my own. I like to try to work in tangent with at least one reporter, but in this case, I was sent basically on my own. And then from after Greece, I drove from Germany all the way to Yugoslavia and back in a car, covering the march across Europe. I mean, I'd never seen such numbers. This was just one train load of immigrants that were coming through, trying to get into Austria, and train loads like this were coming 3 times a day. And each country was trying to push them further west towards Germany, which had basically opened their borders. But first, they had to get through a number of other countries to get there. This was another Afghan woman um, feeding her child while trying to get into on Austria. I mean, I think the number of there's something like 50 million, displaced people around the earth right now. It fluctuates from year to year. Some Syrians have gone back to their country, but then other countries have become more embroiled, and we've received a lot from Central America and Africa this past year. The BP oil field was also sort of a turning point in my career, because this is when I decided that I wanted to start doing environmental journalism. I spent a month going along the Texas, Louisiana coastline. It was a very difficult conflict to cover because of the fact that it was 50 miles offshore. So I would be driving back and forth along the coast, just looking for any oil that was coming in. And covering the BP oil spill just led me to believe that I needed to do more about the environment. I think that we got so distracted by the wars in the Middle East that we sort of neglected the environmental stories that were piling up, and now we're seeing the results of that. So I've taken up underwater photography, although this is not underwater. I've taken up drone photography, and I'm trying to use those skills towards what I'm doing now with environmental photography. This was one of the saddest birds I'd ever seen, with his mouth filled with oil. I did report him, and he was picked up by some rehabilitation organization, but I'm not sure if he survived or not. So yeah, so then I started practicing my underwater photography, and that led to a story that I did this 2 years ago on the Marshall Islands, and the impact that the US government has had using the Marshall Islands as a testing ground for nuclear bombs. I'll show you that in just a second. These are my fish portraits. I'm hoping to do more fish portraits. This is a dome where the US government basically buried a lot of toxic waste after bombing the Marshall Islands, using them as a testing ground. And that dome is now leaking into the surrounding waters. This project came out last year. You can see I used drone and combined that with video. So I really encourage you all to stay up to date with with technology, whatever's coming out, to try to add that to your toolbox, because I think all of that adds to the presentation that we're doing, and making it much more impactful. I also witnessed a fish die off, which was thousands and thousands of these fish, and that was caused by warming seas. While I was there, just high density of the Marshall Islands, and the rising sea levels there. So when I'm back in LA, or when I was living in New York, I used to do a lot of celebrity portraits. Obviously, we're doing fewer of these right now, just because of the coronavirus. But again, I think learning lighting, learning those skills is very important. And I try to embrace that, although I hated doing celebrity portraits when I first came to the LA Times. Now I don't mind them, and it's an important part of it's an important part of not only of our coverage, but also it brings in revenue to the photo department, and we can use that for other projects. So um, it's just some of the many, many celebrity portraits that I've done during my time at the LA Times. I'm sure we'll get back to them next year or as soon as we have this vaccine, which will hopefully be coming soon. We have like 5 minutes to get these portraits, so it's a lot of setup and then a few minutes with a celebrity, and then the stress is over. So just do the best you can in the limited time that you have. And then I use that lighting also for more serious stories. This was a story about children impacted by sexual violence. So, you know, knowing how to shoot a celebrity with good lighting can lead you to using that in other ways. The beginning of January this year, I went to Australia to cover the fires. Obviously, forest fires and wildfires are very critical to California, and to see what was going on in Australia was of interest to our readers here at the LA Times. I got to go to Kangaroo Island, which is has a had a high density of kangaroos and um, koalas. Unfortunately, they were heavily impacted, not only by the fires, but also because of the lack of vegetation. So there were many organizations trying to rescue the koalas and to keep them until new vegetation could grow. But obviously, it's still a big issue going on in Australia at this time. And that brings us to the pandemic. I think access was what was so difficult about the pandemic. It took me a long time to get into a hospital. I was able to get into a few hospitals in Texas, never able to get into a hospital here in California, which has been frustrating for me. Um, but early on, it was very important to show what was going on in the hospitals. I think we've seen a lot of images from the hospitals now, but back in, say, April of this year, it was extremely difficult. And the issues in Texas, of course, are amplified by the fact that they have a large Hispanic population. Some of them live in large family groups, and they are also working in jobs that don't allow them to take time off or to work at home. This is the reporter I was working with, Molly Hennessy Fisk, and that led me to do a series of portraits about the workers that were in one of the hospitals and just the diversity amongst the workers. Many of them were interns coming from other countries to learn about to learn their profession in Texas. And then just to show some of the family units in South Texas, that how they were dealing with carrying on weddings and birthdays and graduations despite the pandemic. And actually, it was leading to a high cases. And I think right now, obviously, Texas and California just passed the 1 million number of victims who have contracted COVID, and the situation in Texas has not improved since I was last there. I'm planning to go back next month as well. This young woman was not only suffering herself, but her two parents had passed away from COVID. And that brings us almost up to the present date. The last thing I was going to show you is a very brief video from Minneapolis. I was sent to Minneapolis. And unfortunately, only the day after I arrived there was a very large protest situation. Actually, the protesters were very peaceful, but they were there was a curfew at place at 8 o'clock at night. And so uh, when the curfew hit, journalists were supposed to be exempt. And this is the first image from a few second video showing the Minnesota State Police advancing on also on the protesters, but as you can see, the journalists were off to the right-hand side. So if you could help, go ahead and play that video. Hello? So it is kind of ironic that I think we have a couple of slides after this, but it's ironic that I've done so much coverage around the world, and yet it wasn't until I reached Minneapolis, that I was injured. I had one of my eyes was heavily burned by the pepper spray, and fortunately, I'm back in action again, and I was only able to really cover this for one night before being injured. Um, but it did bring me to, I took this image. I actually asked this young woman if it was okay if I took her picture and asked her name. But I think there's just has brought up all kinds of new difficulties, which we've just spoken about in the last segment, about how we cover protests and how we deal with people and whether or not they want their images used. So this has been my experience. I mean, I just think what's most important for me is that I was able to take time to learn my craft before starting to do so much international work. I have a very clear sense of what my purpose is when I go to these places. And I think one of the things I wish I had done is find more people to work with. I would rather have worked in a team with a team of people. Most of my life I've been spent working alone, and that I don't think is the best environment. So if you can find people to work with, I think that's very helpful. And not to follow the pack if at all possible. Even if there is a pack, to try to branch off from that pack. I was very fortunate that I had a supportive family. My family's very supportive. I have good friends, and I always try to work with good translators and colleagues in the field. So I helped judge the contest this week, and I know that there's a lot of you who are very passionate about this job, and I look forward to you continuing on covering and documenting what's happening in our country right now. So thank you very much.
Much, Carolyn. Really moving and beautiful work. I enjoyed looking at it. And we do have some questions from people.
Okay.
From Troy Stolt. He is wondering if you found a way to transition from these difficult situations when you're coming back to normal life, and how do you do that?
I think that I was very fortunate because I worked for a newspaper that once I came back, I had expended all my energy while I was covering these stories, and I had tried my hardest and maintained the focus that I had. But when I got back, I usually would just take a few days off and then go back to my normal assignments here, either in LA or in New York. And I think that was a relief for me, not carrying that story on and having the backing of the newspaper. I didn't have to try to sell the images. I didn't have to repackage them. So I would get back to work, and obviously I was going back to some of these places over and over again, but I was able to transition out of it more quickly, I think, in that way.
Another viewer with yes in the works of your work.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Any books of your work?
Do I have a book? I think that's the other thing. I feel like I wish that I had in my career maybe chosen some themes, because I think my work is very disjointed. So if I had to do it over again, I would probably try to find some themes that I would be able to add on to over your career. And I suggest that you do that, whether it's women's issues or whatever the issue might be, and then sort of try to keep your work, give it a framework. I do hope to have a book at some point. I know that the Church of the Nativity is now being made into a movie, and I've been a little bit of a part of that. And I'm in a lot of other books, separate books, but not my own book. So I probably will be looking at retirement in about 5 years, and maybe I'll start on something like that.
We have a question from Paige McKinnon, who wants to know how you handled in your environmental photography seeing the animals hurt in that manner.
Yeah, I mean, it's just devastating seeing the animals hurt. And I mean, it's just as devastating as people, but it's something about an innocent animal or an innocent child that really is difficult to deal with. Um, but that said, I mean, you have, again, you have to remember why you're there. And if you can't fulfill your duty, your job, while you're in the field, then there's no reason for you to be there, really. So, I've just continue to work on other environmental stories. I feel like we have so much to make up for because for 15 years we were distracted by the conflicts in the Middle East, and that our planet is in such a deteriorated state at this point that excuse me, that I think that the rest of my career I'll be working on environmental issues and get some water.
Um, from Erin Hooley, we have a question. She wants to know if there was any action taken against the police in Minnesota after you were injured.
Yes, it was you know very frustrating. The reporter was also injured, but she was shot with multiple rubber bullets. She filed a claim. I know that there was another woman who had lost an eye. I feel fortunate that I did not lose an eye. So there is an investigation into it, but it's been what, over 6 months now, and we've heard nothing from that. Um, but I'm certainly, if I had lost my vision, I would probably have taken further action. But because I was able to recover, um, I think that there's a group effort to find out what happened there. Even the governor admitted the next day that the journalists didn't have to abide by the curfew. What happened though was that the Minnesota State Police had not been out on the streets, and a small group of journalists, including myself, all of us who were wearing our press passes. I had on full black jacket and helmet. It was clear that we were a group of journalists, but because they hadn't encountered anyone, we were the first point of contact, and they just came at us with full force.
Erin also wanted to know, as far as your environmental work goes, what will your next
Mhm.
project be?
Next project. I'm working on a project right now about gray whales. There's an unusual death incident happening in the Pacific Ocean where a number of them are ending up on the beach. It's not clear yet why. I'm highly suspicious it's probably a lack of food. They've had some signs that they're not as healthy as they should be. Some of them are also injured by ships. So that story was supposed to come out this year, but because of the coronavirus, we're having to delay that one more year because the scientists have actually not been out working to investigate what's going on with that. And I just came back from the Marshall Islands where I did a project about the impact of overfishing outside of the marine reserves. I'm very interested in the oceans. I'm a sailor, a scuba diver, and I was very fortunate to get to go to the Galapagos Islands when there were no other tourists and to see them sort of in a very pristine state. That being said, these marine parks are the birthing place for fish and all kinds of wildlife. But once they need to start migrating, they are being entrapped by commercial fishermen at an alarming rate. So I'm glad to see that they've just established a new marine reserve in the Atlantic Ocean, but we definitely need more marine reserves around the world to help protect our oceans. And I hope some of you all will go into environmental journalism because I can think of nothing that's any more important at this point in our history.
We have just a minute left and time for just maybe one more question.
Mhm.
Frank would like to know at the end of the day, especially when you're covering conflict, what are you doing to help reset for the next day?
Reset. There's really no time to reset. I mean, I'm a daily photographer, daily journalist, so I go out, I shoot all day until dark, maybe a little after dark. I come back, I edit all the photos, and I transmit all the photos, and then it's time to go to bed. So there's really not much resetting before the next day. But I do think that that regimen has kept me healthier mentally. I'm not sitting around. I'm constantly working, and I'm moving from one story to the next. And also because I'm not having to find a publication site for the work. I'm just able to focus purely. I mean, it's given me the maximum freedom having the newspaper behind me and just being able to um, focus on what's in front of me. And I really do believe that that's my job, to just on what I'm seeing and to be the conduit for other people and show them what I'm seeing, whether it's at home or abroad or wherever I go. So I hope you all will continue in that vein as well.
All right, please question. We've got a question. Do you think that photojournalism is dead today with the advent of social media and the demise of news?
No, I don't think it's dead. I think it's more important than ever. I do think it's a little bit more difficult to be to be seen because there are so many cameras out there, so many iPhones, so many citizen journalists. But there will always be a need for good photojournalism that's of a high standard. And I do think that newspapers are a great place to get into the business if you can find an internship or a small newspaper to work at. I still believe that whether you want to end up working at National Geographic or to make movies or do documentaries, I think newspapers are a great training ground to get that experience that you need and to build your competence. But I think there will always be a need for high quality photojournalism.
All right. Well, thank you again so much for sharing all your pictures and your experience over just your entire career. I really enjoyed hosting you, and I know that everybody enjoyed
Thanks, Betta.
watching.
And please let everybody know if they need any career advice. I'm here for them. You can always find me at latimes.com. So thank you very much.
Thank you.